Islam in danger. As with the Muslim world, more widely, the single most important thing to understand about patterns both of Muslim history and of Muslim consciousness in South Asia is the tremendous rise of Muslim power up to the 17th century and its steep decline thereafter. Before 1947, the glorious history of Muslim rule and cultural achievement in South Asia helped make it impossible for Muslims to accept a subordinate position in what they saw as a future Hindu-dominated India. By the same token, for a long time after the independence and to a degree even today, Pakistanis have felt that they not only must compete with India, but they must compete on an equal footing, and that to accept anything less would be humiliating betrayal. This history also contributes to the fact that, in the words of Iqbal Akhund, the Pakistani Muslim thinks of himself as heir to the Muslim empire, descended from a race of conquerors and rulers. There is therefore a streak of militarism in Pakistan's ethos. By 1682, when Ottoman Muslim troops were battering the walls of Vienna, the Mughal Empire ruled, albeit often very loosely, almost the whole of South Asia. The Mughals built on previous Muslim sultanates of Delhi that had ruled most of North India since the 13th century. Even after the Mughal Empire began to fall to pieces in the first half of the 18th century, great Muslim successive dynasties in Awadh, Bengal, Bhopal, Hyderabad and Mysore continued to rule over most of what is now India. While Muslim soldiers conquered, Muslim missionaries converted, but much more slowly. Outside what is now Pakistan, only in Bengal was the majority of population over a large area converted to Islam. A central tragedy of modern Muslim history in South Asia has been that, as a result, the great centers of Muslim civilization in South Asia were established in the midst of Hindu population, far from the areas of Muslim majority population. The decline of Muslim power and the partition of 1947 left almost all the greatest Muslim cities, monuments and institutions of South Asia as islands in an Indian Sea, towards which Pakistanis look as if from a distant shore towards the lost Atlantis. The old Muslim dynasties of South Asia were as a rule not severely oppressive towards their Hindu subjects. They could not afford to be, given Hindu numerical predominance and the continued existence of innumerable local Hindu princes. At the popular level, Hindu and Muslim religious practice often merged. Just as in Europe, Christianity took on many traditions from the local pagan religions. At the highest level, the Mughal Emperor Akbar, 1542 to 1605, found the Deen-e-Ilahi, divine faith, a syncretic cult containing elements of Islam, Hinduism and Christianity. Nonetheless, in the Muslim kingdoms, there was no doubt which religion was foremost in the state. As the great mosques, which dominate the old Muslim capitals testify and were meant to testify, the Deen-e-Ilahi cult failed completely to root itself, which like all attempts to dilute or syncreticize Islam, provoking a severe backlash from orthodox Muslim clerics who undermined Akbar's authority. The last great Mughal emperor Aurangzeb, 1618 to 1707, responded to the increasing problems of his empire with a program of strict religious orthodoxy. As elsewhere in the Muslim world, the decline of Muslim power from the early 18th century produced a complex set of religious and cultural responses, the great majority of which, however, had the same ultimate goal, namely to strengthen the power of Muslims in the face of their enemies and to strengthen Muslim unity in the face of Muslims' own divisions. From the later 18th century, Muslim fears were focused above all on the rise of British. In 1803, the Mughal emperor became a British pensionary. Since those days, religious forms of Muslim resistance to Western power have been a constant in South Asian history, ebbing and flowing but never disappearing. From the mid-19th century on, they have been joined by a very different response, that of Westernization. It is important to note, however, that the great majority of Westerners have justified their programs in public by arguing that they were necessary in order to strengthen their communities, their countries, or the Muslim world in general against the non-Muslim enemies. In other words, these figures were no more necessarily pro-Western in geopolitical terms than they were the Westerners of Japan. This is something that the West would do well to remember. Given our congenial illusion that anyone who shares aspects of our culture must necessarily agree with our foreign policy. The Muslim religious response to Western power has always been a highly complex mixture of conservative and radical elements. Many of these have been reformist, but reformist in the sense of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, not of modern Western reform. They have also shared the fundamentalism of parts of the Protestant tradition, in the sense of a return to the fundamentals of the original religious scriptures. All have stressed the need for Muslims to wage the greater jihad of spiritual struggle and personal and social purification, as well as the lesser jihad of war against Islam's enemies. Underpinning intellectual and political responses by Muslim elites has been a diffuse but widespread sense among the Muslim masses of Islam in danger. This has contributed to episodes, both of mass mobilization and of savage local violence against non-Muslims or other Muslims portrayed as non-Muslims. These combined in the developments of leading to the creation of Pakistan in 1947. This sense of an endangered Islam has long been fueled not only by local or even regional events, but by developments in the wider Muslim world. For example, in the later 19th century and early 20th century, the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the face of the attack from Christian powers. The role of the Ummah in minds of most South Asians, therefore, might be seen as vaguely analogous to that of Christendom in the European Middle Ages. Not something that could ever trump local powers and allegiances and lead to a universal state, but nonetheless a potent idea with important cultural, intellectual, emotional, political, and international consequences, not least in the form of crusades. With the disappearance of France and Britain as ruling powers in Muslim world, the focus of Muslim fears concerning the Western threats to the wider Muslim world naturally shifted to the new state of Israel in occupation of Islam's third holiest shrine, as Pakistanis are continually reminded by their mosques and their media, and Israel's sponsor, the United States. In Pakistan, however, hostility to the US was for a long time damped by the fact that Pakistan was facing far more pressing dangers against which the US provided at least a measure of security: India and the Soviet Union. Thus, 1980s, President Zia's Islamization program contained no hint of anti-Americanism for the obvious reason that the US was both an essential ally in fighting against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and an essential financial sponsor of Pakistan and Zia's administration. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto made considerable play with anti-American sentiment and with the idea of Pakistan as a leader of the Muslim world, including his rhetoric of a Pakistani Islamic bomb. His own anti-Americanism owed more to the fashionable left-wing thought of the time. The collapse of left-wing nationalism in the Muslim world in the last quarter of the 20th century left the Islamists as the last political homeland of anti-American and anti-colonial sentiment. After 1989, a series of developments shattered the previous obstacles to anti-Americanism in Pakistan. First, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan and the subsequent collapse of Soviet Union itself removed Pakistan's value to the US as an ally. Instead, free rein was given to groups in Washington that feared Pakistan's nuclear program to press for sanctions on the country. The prominent role of the Israel lobby and pro-Israeli politicians such as Congressman Stephen Solars in these moves helped increase existing anti-Israeli feeling in Pakistan and focus attention on US-Israel alliance. The anger this caused in Pakistan was exacerbated by the way in which the US abandoned all responsibility for the consequences of a war in Afghanistan, which it had done so much to fuel, leaving Pakistan facing a civil war on its borders and a continuing refugee problem. Of even greater importance has been Washington's increasing tilt to India, replacing the mutual hostility that characterized most of the period from 1947 to 1991. Seen from Pakistan, this was reflected first in Washington's willingness to punish Pakistan as well as India for the nuclear race in South Asia, despite the fact that in both 1974 and 1998, it was actually India which first exploded nuclear devices. Moreover, because of its far smaller economy and greater dependence on exports to the West, the US sanctions of 1990s hit Pakistan much worse than India and were in fact largely responsible for the economic stagnation of that decade. Since 9/11, the US has sought a quasi-alliance with India amid much talk in the US of building up India as a force against both China and Islamist extremism. The US has abandoned any pretense at parity in its approach to the Indian and Pakistani nuclear programs and has sought active nuclear partnership, albeit with qualifications concerning security with India. The US has put immense pressure on Pakistan concerning sponsorship of militant and terrorist groups in India and Indian-controlled Kashmir, but has repeatedly backed away from any attempt to put pressure on India to reach a settlement of the Kashmir conflict, notably when, in early 2009, pressure from India and Indian lobby in the US led to India being swiftly dropped from the responsibilities of the Obama administration's regional special envoy, Richard Holbrooke. Also of great importance in creating anti-American feeling in Pakistan has been the belief that Washington has supported authoritarian governments in Pakistan. This belief is stimulated by US aid to Generals Ayub, Zia and Musharraf. Today it is focused on US help to President Zardari, which just goes to show that US administration have no preference for military government or indeed any kind of government in Pakistan as long as that government does what the US wants. Pakistanis also tend greatly to exaggerate the degree of hands-on control that the US can exert over Pakistani governments. In fact, the relationship with the US has always been one of mutual exploitation, heavily flavored with mutual suspicion. Ayub went to war with India and cultivated relations with China against US wishes. Zia diverted US aid to Pakistan's particular allies among the Afghan Mujahideen. Successive Pakistani administrations developed a nuclear deterrent in the face of strong pressure from Washington, and since 9/11, Pakistani governments have only very partially acceded to US wishes in the war on terror. However, in Pakistan, facts are rarely allowed to get in the way of a good conspiracy theory, and the widespread belief among Pakistanis is that the US runs their country as a new colonial client state. As a conclusive blow to pro-US sentiment in Pakistan came the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. In the immediate wake of 9/11, to judge by my researches in Pakistan in 2001 to 2002, the US move into Afghanistan was accepted with surprisingly little protest by most Pakistanis, and there was some willingness to accept Al-Qaeda's responsibility. The invasion of Iraq, however, and the mendacious arguments used by Bush administration to justify the invasion appear to confirm every Muslim fear about the American threat to the Muslim world. The disastrous impact of this invasion of Pakistan is reflected in the fact that it retrospectively destroyed the justification for the Afghan war as well, as far as most Pakistanis are concerned. This shift is reflected in the fact that, to judge by my own interviews and those of other Western colleagues, an absolutely overwhelming majority not just of Pakistani masses but of Pakistani elites believe that 9/11 was not, in fact, carried out by Al-Qaeda but was a plot by Bush administration, Israel, or both intended to provide a pretext for the US invasion of Afghanistan as a part of the US strategy of dominating the Muslim world. Whenever a Westerner, or more likely rarely a sensible Pakistani, attempts to argue with this poisonous rubbish, we are immediately countered by the argument that Bush lied over Iraq. So why are you saying he couldn't have lied about 9/11? The US invasion of Iraq, coming on the top of US support for Israel and growing ties to India, greatly strengthened the vague and incoherent but pervasive feeling about Pakistanis that Islam is in danger at the hands of the US. The effects of all this on the desires of Pakistanis to make sacrifices in order to help the US in the war on terror should hardly need emphasis. Instead, from the widespread hostility to the Afghan Taliban in 2001 to 2002, by 2007 to 2009, the perception of them on the part of the vast majority of ordinary Pakistanis with whom I spoke at the time had become close to their view of the Afghan Mujahideen during my time in Pakistan in the late 1980s. Mujahideen, not nice people or ones they would wish to see ruling Pakistan, but nonetheless brave men waging a legitimate war of resistance or defensive jihad against an alien or infidel occupation of their country. Naturally, therefore, there has been intense opposition within Pakistan to the Pakistani military helping the US by attacking the Afghan Taliban in Pakistan's border areas. For a long time, this opposition extended to the Pakistani militants in the region who were seen as simply attempting to help their Afghan brethren carry on the legitimate struggle. This opposition diminished somewhat as the extent of the militant threat to Pakistan became apparent in 2008 to 2009, and Pakistani media became much more hostile to Pakistani Taliban. It remains, however, a very powerful strain of public opinion, and opposition to military campaign against the Pakistani Taliban and hostility to the US alliance in general have done terrible damage to the administrations of both President Musharraf and his successor President Zardari.